The rain poured down in thick sheets, blurring the city lights into a swirl of gold and silver. A woman stood at the entrance of a towering glass skyscraper, her fingers tightening around the handle of her umbrella. She had been here before years ago, but back then she had walked through those doors with confidence, her hand resting in his. Now, she hesitated, she inhaled deeply, steadying herself. The past had a way of creeping up when you least expected it. When she left, she swore she would never return, never look back. She had escaped a world of power, money, and cold perfection, a life where love felt more like a contract than something real. But now she had no choice. Inside, the billionaire sat at his desk, completely unaware of what was coming. His life was pristine, controlled, exactly how he wanted it. He built empires, made fortunes, and commanded respect with a single glance. Yet, for all his success, there was one thing he had never been able to control: her absence. She was the one person who had slipped through his fingers, leaving behind nothing but silence, and now, after all these years, she was back. She stepped into the lobby, her heels clicking against the marble floor, her heartbeat matching the rhythm. Security glanced at her, unsure whether to stop her or let her pass. But before they could react, the elevator doors slid open, and she stepped inside. The ride-up felt like a lifetime. Memories rushed in: late nights, whispered arguments, stolen kisses under city lights. She pushed them aside. There was no time for nostalgia. She had come with a purpose. When the doors finally parted, she saw him, sitting behind his massive desk, framed by the glittering skyline. He looked exactly as she remembered: sharp, composed, powerful. But when his eyes met hers, something shifted. For the first time in years, his mask cracked. Silence stretched between them, thick with everything left unsaid. Then, finally, she spoke. "I didn't come back for the reasons you think." His jaw tightened. "Then why are you here?" she exhaled, steadying herself. This was it. The moment that would change everything, because there's something you need to know. And it's going to change your life forever. The air between them grew heavy. His expression darkened, torn between curiosity and dread, and just like that, the past they thought was buried had returned, bringing with it a secret neither of them were ready for. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he studied her, as if trying to decide whether she was real or just a shadow from the past. His fingers curled into a fist on the desk, knuckles whitening, but his voice remained calm. "Then tell me," she hesitated. The words felt heavy, almost too much to say out loud. But she had come this far. There was no turning back. "It's about us," she finally said, her voice quieter than she intended. His expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, something almost dangerous. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly, as if weighing her words. "There is no use anymore," he said. "You made sure of that when you left." The pain in his voice was almost imperceptible, but she caught it. It hit harder than she expected. She had prepared for anger, for coldness, but not for this. "I know," she admitted, gripping the edge of the chair across from him. "And I wouldn't be here if I had any other choice." A humorless smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "You always have a choice." She swallowed hard, her mind flashing back to the night she walked away. It hadn't been easy. If anything, it was the hardest thing she'd ever done. But she had done it for a reason. A reason she could no longer keep to herself. "I should have told you before," she admitted, her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag. "But I was scared." His jaw clenched. Scared of what? She looked away, suddenly unsure if she could say it. The truth had sat heavy on her chest for years, locked away where no one could touch it. But now it was clawing its way out, refusing to be silenced. "Scared that if you knew, everything would change," she whispered. His eyes darkened, and for the first time, a hint of impatience cracked through his controlled exterior. "Everything already changed the day you left." She flinched. He was right. Nothing had been the same since. But now, everything was about to shift again. She forced herself to meet his gaze, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure he could hear it. "You deserve to know the truth," she said. The tension between them thickened, the air growing colder. He watched her, waiting. But she wasn't ready to say it. Not yet. Instead, she reached into her bag, pulling out a small envelope. She placed it on his desk, her fingers lingering for a moment before she pulled away. "Read it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He didn't move at first, his eyes locked on hers, as if trying to read the truth in her expression. Then, slowly, he reached for the envelope, flipping it over in his hands. The moment he opened it, his entire world shifted. She watched as his expression hardened, the color draining from his face. His hands trembled slightly as he pulled out the single photograph inside. His breath caught. It was a picture of a child with eyes just like his. Silence filled the room, thick and suffocating. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just stared at the photo, his grip tightening around the edges as if it might disappear if he let go. Finally, he looked up, and when he did, there was no hiding the storm in his eyes. "Is this?" She nodded before he could finish. "Yes." His jaw clenched so tightly, she thought it might shatter. "How long?" His voice was low, controlled, but she could hear the crack beneath it. 4 years, she admitted, her own voice shaking. "He's 4. He inhaled sharply, the weight of her words hitting him like a tidal wave. "And you never told me?" Tears burned at the back of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "I wanted to. I almost did. But every time, I convinced myself it was better this way." His laugh was sharp, bitter. "Better for who?" She looked down, guilt pressing against her ribs. "I thought I was protecting him. And you? Protecting me?" His voice rose slightly, the first real crack in his composure. "You kept my son from me for 4 years, and you think that was protection?" She flinched, but didn't look away. "I was scared," she admitted. "You had your world, your business, your life. I didn't think you'd want this. I didn't think you'd want him." His entire body tensed. "You had no right to decide that for me." She swallowed hard. "I know." The room fell into silence again, but this time it was different. Heavy. Unbearable. Finally, he set the photograph down, his hands shaking as he pressed his fingers against his temple. He exhaled slowly, forcing himself to steady. "What's his name?" he asked, his voice quieter now, her throat tightened. "Leo." He let the name settle between them, as if testing how it felt in the air. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Where is he now?" "With my sister," she said. "He's safe." His gaze sharpened. "I need to see him." Panic flared in her chest. "Not yet," she said quickly, his expression darkened. "You don't get to decide that anymore, I know," she admitted. "But I need you to understand something first." He clenched his jaw, waiting. She hesitated, her heart pounding. There was more, so much more, that he didn't know. And if she told him everything, she wasn't sure if he'd ever forgive her. But she had no choice, because the truth wasn't just about their son. It was about the reason she left in the first place, and the danger that still lurked in the shadows. She took a shaky breath, knowing that the hardest part was still ahead. Telling him about Leo was only the beginning. The real reason she had left, the real reason she had kept their son a secret, was something far more dangerous. He was still staring at her, his fingers curled into fists against the desk. "What else?" he asked, his voice quiet but firm. "Because I can tell there's more." She hesitated. Once she said the words, there would be no going back. "I didn't just leave because of us," she finally admitted. "I left because someone wanted me gone." His entire body went rigid. What? She swallowed hard. "I was threatened." His eyes darkened, a storm brewing beneath his controlled expression. "By who?" She hesitated. Saying the name out loud felt like inviting the past to come crashing back in. "But he deserved to know your father." She whispered, the words hung between them like a knife, for the first time since she had stepped into his office. He looked truly shocked. He blinked, his face unreadable. "My father," she nodded, gripping the edge of the chair. "He told me to leave. And he made it clear what would happen if I didn't." His jaw clenched so tightly, she thought it might crack. "What did he say?" she exhaled shakily. "That if I stayed, I would ruin you. That I didn't belong in your world. And if I ever tried to come back, he'd make sure I regretted it." Silence then. Slowly, he stood up. The movement was controlled, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the fury burning just beneath the surface. "He threatened you." His voice was dangerously low. She nodded. "And at first, I thought it was just a warning. But then strange things started happening. My apartment was broken into. My car was tampered with. And then one night, someone followed me home." His entire expression changed. The anger was still there, but now something else flickered in his eyes. "Fear. Why didn't you tell me?" He demanded. "Because I knew you'd fight him," she said, her voice breaking. "And I knew what he was capable of. I couldn't risk it. I couldn't risk you." He let out a slow, measured breath, running a hand through his hair. She could see the war raging inside him, the need to understand, to fix, to go back and undo everything. But it was too late for that. "And now?" he asked. "Why come back now?" She looked him straight in the eye. "Because I think he knows about Leo." The moment she said it, the air shifted. The tension between them snapped into something new. Sharper, his expression darkened. "Are you saying I don't know how? But I think he found out," she said quickly. "A few weeks ago, I started getting calls from unknown numbers. Then someone tried to break into my house." His fists clenched. "Did you go to the police?" She let out a hollow laugh. "And tell them what? That a powerful billionaire's father has been keeping an eye on me for years? That I left because I was afraid of what he might do?" She shook her head. "They wouldn't listen. They'd think I was making it up. Or worse, they'd tell him he took a step closer, his presence overwhelming." "So you came to me?" Instead, she nodded. "Because no matter what happened between us, I knew you were the only one who could protect him." A muscle in his jaw twitched. He was furious, not at her, but at everything. At the years lost. At the lies. At the fact that his father had done something so unforgivable. He turned away, pressing his hands against the desk as if trying to steady himself. "Where is he now?" "With my sister," she repeated. "But I don't know if that's enough. If he really knows about Leo, then keeping him hidden won't be enough." He exhaled sharply, his shoulders rising and falling. When he turned back to her, there was no hesitation in his eyes. "Then we bring him here." Panic flared in her chest. "What?" "No. That's exactly what he wants." He shook his head. "No, what he wants is to keep us apart. To keep me in the dark. But now that I know the truth, he's lost his advantage." Her heart pounded. "You don't know that. You don't know what he'll do." His expression hardened. "Then let's find out." She stared at him, her mind racing. She had spent years running, hiding, convincing herself that this was the only way. But now, sitting in front of him, she realized something terrifying. She wasn't sure if she had ever really escaped at all. And worse, now that she had come back, she wasn't sure if she ever would. She could feel the weight of his words settling over her, pressing against the air between them. Bringing Leo here. It was the exact opposite of what she had spent years trying to do. Keep him safe. Keep him far away from all of this. But now, the walls she had built were crumbling, and for the first time, she wasn't sure if she had been protecting her son or just delaying the inevitable. "You don't understand," she said, shaking her head. "If your father really knows, then bringing Leo here makes us sitting targets." His eyes darkened. "Do you really think I would let anything happen to him?" The certainty in his voice was almost enough to make her believe it. Almost. But she knew better than to underestimate the man who had forced her out of this life in the first place. His father wasn't just powerful, He was ruthless. And if he had gone through all this trouble to keep her away, then he wouldn't stop now. "I don't know what you would do," she admitted, "because I don't know who you are anymore." Something flickered in his expression, just for a second. A flash of pain, quickly buried beneath the cold mask he wore so well. "You think I've changed?" "He asked, you had to," she replied. "I left, and you," she hesitated. "You moved on. You built your life without me." His jaw tightened. "You think I had a choice?" Silence stretched between them, thick with everything unsaid. She looked away first. There was no point in reliving the past, not when the present was unraveling so fast. "We need a plan," he finally said. "If my father is watching you, he's watching your sister too. Keeping Leo hidden won't be enough." A cold shiver ran through her. "You think he's already made a move?" "I think," he said carefully, "that my father doesn't take risks. If he knows, he's been watching for a long time." Her stomach twisted. How many times had she convinced herself that she was being paranoid? That the shadows she felt following her were just in her head? Now, all those small moments, the unease, the strange phone calls, the feeling that someone was always one step behind her made terrifying sense. "He won't stop," she whispered. "He'll come for Leo. He'll come for me." His expression turned deadly serious. "Then we don't wait for him to make the next move. We go first." A lump formed in her throat. "And do what?" His eyes locked onto hers, unwavering. "Take back control." She could see it in his face, the sharp, calculated look of a man who had spent years building an empire, learning how to outthink and outmaneuver his enemies. The man she once loved was still there, but he had hardened, become something sharper, more dangerous. "How?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted the answer. "We find out what he knows. How long he's been watching. Who he's using." His voice was steel. "And we make sure he never gets the chance to touch Leo." She exhaled slowly, trying to steady the panic rising in her chest. "You think you can beat him?" His gaze didn't waver. "I know I can." She wanted to believe him. But she also knew the man they were up against. And if he was playing this game, it meant he had already decided he was going to win. A knock at the door cut through the tension. They both froze. His eyes flickered toward the door, then back to her. His entire body tensed, like a predator waiting to strike. "Did anyone follow you here?" Her pulse spiked. I don't think so." He moved toward the door slowly, his posture rigid, controlled. He glanced at the security feed on his desk, and his expression darkened. "It's one of my father's men." Her breath caught. "What, he's never sent them here before?" he murmured, more to himself than to her. "He never had a reason to, until now." She could barely breathe. "What do we do?" He turned to her, something fierce burning in his eyes. "We don't let them know we're afraid." He strode to the door, unlocking it with a calmness that made her stomach turn. When he pulled it open, the man on the other side stood stiffly, his face blank, professional. But she could see it in his eyes. "He was here with a message. Your father requests a meeting," the man said, his tone cold. Tonight, her heart slammed against her ribs. He didn't flinch. "And if I say no?" The man's lips pressed into a thin line. "Then he'll come to you." A heavy silence followed. She could feel the air shift, like the walls were closing in. "Tell him I'll be there," he said, his voice calm. The man gave a curt nod before turning and walking away the moment the door shut. She turned to him, panic rising. "You're going," he exhaled slowly. "I don't have a choice." "You always have a choice," she shot back. "And if you walk into that meeting, he's going to make sure you play by his rules." A bitter smile tugged at his lips. "Then I guess it's time I start changing the game." Her chest tightened. She could see it already, how this was unfolding, how it was leading them down a road neither of them could control. She had tried so hard to stay away from this world. But now, no matter what she did, she was right back in the center of it, and this time, the stakes were higher than ever. She could feel her pulse in her throat as she watched him, waiting for him to say something, anything that would make this feel less inevitable. But his face was unreadable, his thoughts locked behind an expression she had once known how to decipher. Now she wasn't sure. "You don't have to do this," she whispered. He exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "You think I want to? This isn't about me anymore." His eyes flickered toward her, then away. "It's about Leo. About you. He's been pulling the strings from the shadows for too long. If I don't face him now, he'll never stop." The weight of his words settled over her, heavy and unshakable. She had spent years trying to stay ahead of this storm, but it had finally caught up to her. There was no outrunning it anymore. "Then I'm coming with you," she said, his head snapped toward her, his expression sharp. "No," she lifted her chin. "You don't get to tell me what to do. This isn't up for debate," he shot back. "You don't know what he's capable of." Her stomach twisted. "I know exactly what he's capable of. That's why I can't let you go alone." Something passed between them, then a silent battle of wills, a conversation they had already had in so many different ways. But this time, there was no winning. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. "You don't understand. If something happens to you, then at least I won't be waiting in the dark, wondering if you're ever coming back." His jaw clenched, but he didn't argue. Maybe he knew there was no point. A knock at the door made both of them tense. This time, it wasn't his father's men. It was his head of security, standing stiffly in the doorway. "Sir, the car is ready," the man said. His gaze flickered to her, uncertain. "Are we bringing her as well?" She didn't look away from him. "Yes," he hesitated, but then gave a short nod. The drive felt endless. The city lights blurred outside the window, and the air inside the car was thick with unspoken tension. She could feel him beside her, his hands clenched into fists against his legs. He looked calm, but she knew better. When they pulled up to the estate, the sight of it sent ice through her veins. She had been here once before, so many years ago. Back when she had thought love was enough to protect them. Back when she had still believed in happy endings. Now, it felt like she was walking into a trap. The guards at the entrance barely looked at them as they stepped inside. The house was exactly as she remembered. Too big, too cold, too empty. But there was something different this time. A feeling in the air, like the walls were closing in. His father was waiting for them in the study, standing by the fireplace with a glass of whiskey in his hand. He looked older, but no less dangerous. His expression barely changed when they entered, but she saw the slight curl of his lips, the satisfaction in his eyes. "You actually came," he said, swirling his drink. "I wasn't sure you would." "You gave me no choice," he replied. His father chuckled, shaking his head. "There is always a choice. You just never seem to make the right one." His gaze slid to her. And look who decided to come back from the dead. She forced herself to meet his eyes, even as her heart pounded. "You already knew I was alive. You've been watching me for years, haven't you?" His expression didn't change. "It was never about you. It was about ensuring my son didn't make the same mistake twice." A sharp breath left her lungs, but she refused to let him see how much those words cut. "And Leo?" she demanded. "Was he a mistake too?" For the first time, something flickered in his eyes. Not shock, he already knew. But there was something else, something darker. "So it's true," he mused. "I had my suspicions, but I wasn't certain." He set his glass down with a quiet clink. "Interesting." She felt him tense beside her, his entire body going rigid. "If you so much as think about touching him," his father held up a hand. "Let's not be dramatic." He took a seat, crossing one leg over the other. "I simply wanted to have a conversation. A civilized one." She didn't believe that for a second. "You forced her to leave," he said, his voice dangerously low. "You threatened her." His father sighed. "And yet, here she is." You have to admit, the irony is almost poetic. He leaned forward, lacing his fingers together. "Tell me, son, what exactly do you plan to do now?" His jaw tightened. "I plan to undo every single thing you've done." A slow, knowing smile stretched across his father's face. "And how do you plan to do that?" The room went silent. She could feel the walls closing in, the moment before everything shattered. And then the doors burst open. One of the guards rushed in, his face pale. "Sir, there's been an intrusion." The air changed in an instant. His father's eyes narrowed. "What, someone breached the property?" the guard said quickly. "We don't know how they got in." Her heart slammed against her ribs. His father stood slowly, his expression unreadable. Well. His gaze flickered to them. "It seems we have company." A chill ran down her spine. She didn't know who had come, but she knew one thing for certain: this was only the beginning. The air in the room shifted, thick with tension, as the guard's words settled. An intrusion. That meant one of two things: either someone had come to help them, or someone had come to end this for good. His father barely moved, but she could see the flicker of something sharp in his eyes. He hadn't planned for this. That meant whoever had gotten in wasn't working for him. His voice was calm when he spoke. "Seal the exits. Find out who it is." The guard nodded and hurried out, leaving the room in silence. She felt the weight of his father's gaze shift back to them, measuring, calculating. "Did you plan this?" he asked, tilting his head slightly. He stiffened beside her. "If I had, you'd already know it." His father studied him, then let out a low chuckle. "Of course. You were never one for reckless decisions." His gaze flickered to her. But she wasn't she? She forced herself to hold his stare. "You seem nervous." His expression didn't change, but she saw the slight shift in his posture, the way his fingers tapped against the armrest of his chair. A man like him was never caught off guard. But right now, something was wrong, and he knew it. A sharp sound echoed from down the hall, a scuffle, the dull thud of bodies colliding. Someone was fighting then. A gunshot. She flinched, her breath catching in her throat. His father sighed, standing slowly. "It seems our guest is impatient." He glanced at his son. "Shall we?" The guards outside the study were already moving, their weapons drawn, as they hurried toward the commotion. He grabbed her wrist before she could follow them. "Stay behind me," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. She opened her mouth to argue, but the look in his eyes stopped her for once. She listened. The hallway was chaos. Two of his father's guards were already down, their bodies motionless on the marble floor. A third was pressed against the wall, blood seeping from a wound on his arm. But her eyes locked onto the figure standing in the middle of it all. She hadn't seen him in years. And yet, there he was, the last person she ever expected to show up here. His father's expression darkened. "You," he murmured, the first trace of real surprise slipping through his mask. The man standing before them smirked, his gun still raised. "Took you long enough." She could barely breathe. How was this possible? He had disappeared years ago, vanished without a trace. Everyone had assumed he was dead. And yet, here he was, alive, armed, and clearly very much in control of the situation. "You should be dead," his father said coldly. The man shrugged. "Yeah, well, I never was good at doing what you wanted." His eyes flickered toward her, and there was something unreadable in them. "Hello again." She swallowed hard. "What are you doing here?" His smirk faded. "Saving your life." Her blood ran cold. Before she could respond, more footsteps pounded through the hallway. His father's reinforcements. The man raised his gun. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." The guards hesitated, glancing at his father for orders. "You came all this way," his father said, his voice deceptively calm. "Tell me why now." The man's gaze darkened. "Because I finally have proof." A beat of silence. His father tilted his head slightly. "Proof of what?" The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "That you've been lying to your son his entire life." Everything stopped. She felt him tense beside her, his breathing sharp and uneven. "What are you talking about?" The man's expression hardened. "I know what he did. I know what he's been hiding. And so do you, don't you?" His gaze locked onto her. Her stomach dropped. Because deep down, she did know. She had always known there was something more. Something his father had kept buried. Something that had forced her to run all those years ago. She just never thought she would hear it spoken out loud. His father's voice was ice. "You're bluffing." The man chuckled. "Am I?" Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small drive, holding it up between two fingers. "Everything's on here," he said. Every lie, every secret, every reason she had to leave. She felt the world tilting around her. This was it. The moment everything shattered. The room felt frozen in time, the weight of his words pressing down on all of them. The small drive in his hand was so unassuming, yet it held the power to change everything. She could see it now, the truth that had been lurking in the shadows for years. Waiting to be exposed, his father's eyes flickered with something dangerous, but his voice remained cold. "You think a simple drive is enough to bring me down?" The man holding it smirked. "No, but the people I've already sent copies to." They might. A muscle in his father's jaw twitched, the first real crack in his carefully controlled mask. "You're lying," he said. But there was no certainty in his tone anymore. "Try me." The man challenged beside her. She felt him stiffen, his breath uneven. He was still processing it, all the possibility that his entire life had been built on lies, that the father he had spent years trying to outrun had been hiding something far worse than he ever imagined. His father exhaled sharply, straightening his shoulders. "And what do you want in return for this revelation?" The man's smirk faded. "For starters, you step down. No more control, no more threats, no more pretending you're untouchable." "It's over." His father let out a low, humorless laugh. "And if I refuse?" The man didn't hesitate. "Then I make sure the whole world sees the truth." A charged silence filled the space for the first time. His father looked at his son, not with manipulation, not with cold calculation, but with something that almost resembled regret. "Almost. I did it to protect you," he said quietly. He shook his head, his voice raw. "You did it to protect yourself." His father's gaze darkened. "You don't understand." "No," he cut in, his voice steel. "I understand perfectly now. And I'm done." The finality in his words sent a ripple through the room. His father exhaled slowly, then turned his gaze back to the man with the drive. "And what's stopping me from ending this here?" The man smiled, slow and knowing. "Because you know I planned for that too." And then, as if on cue, the sound of sirens filled the air. It was over. She saw it in his father's eyes, the realization that he had lost, that the empire he had built was crumbling beneath him. He had spent years controlling every piece of the game, but now, for the first time, he had no more moves left to make. The guards hesitated, looking at him for orders. But there were none to give. She reached for his hand, gripping it tightly. This was it. The moment they had been running toward, or maybe running from, all along. His father turned to leave. But then, just as he reached the door, he paused. He glanced over his shoulder, his gaze settling on his son. "One last time. You'll regret this," he said softly. But there was no power in his words anymore. And then he was gone. The weight of everything hit her all at once, her knees almost buckling. It was over. Or at least, she thought it was. Until the man with the drive turned to her and said, "There's something else you need to know." Her breath caught, because just when she thought the truth had finally come out, there was still one more secret left to uncover. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she stared at him, the weight of his words settling into her bones. There was something else, another truth, another secret, waiting just beyond the surface. She wasn't sure she could take any more, but the look in his eyes told her there was no turning back now. She swallowed hard. "What is it?" The man glanced at him, then back at her, hesitating for a fraction of a second. "It's about Leo." Her breath hitched. "What about him?" His expression was unreadable. "He's not who you think he is." A chill ran down her spine. "What are you talking about?" The man hesitated, then pulled a small envelope from his jacket and handed it to her. Her fingers trembled as she took it, staring at the simple, unmarked paper. Slowly, she tore it open and pulled out the single sheet inside. As her eyes scanned the words, the ground seemed to shift beneath her. No, this couldn't be real. She lifted her gaze, barely able to form the words. "How? How did you find this?" "I've been digging for years," the man said quietly, "trying to piece together everything your father-in-law buried. And this was the one thing he never wanted you to know." She felt him move closer beside her, his voice tight with tension. "What does it say?" She turned the paper toward him, her hands shaking. He took it, his brows furrowing as he read. Then slowly, his expression changed. Shock. Pain, betrayal. She knew exactly what he was feeling, because she felt it too. Leo wasn't his brother, Leo was his son. The truth settled over them like a heavy fog. Suffocating, impossible to escape. She had always known there were missing pieces. The way his father had controlled everything, the way he had forced her to leave, the way he had kept secrets buried so deep no one could find them. But this changed everything. He let out a sharp breath, his fingers tightening around the paper. "This isn't possible," the man sighed. "I thought the same thing. But the DNA test doesn't lie." Her heart pounded. "Your father knew," she whispered. "That's why he sent me away. He wasn't protecting you. He was protecting himself." He took a step back, shaking his head as if trying to clear it. "All these years, he let me believe." His voice cracked. "He let me believe I lost everything." Tears burned at her eyes. "He took that from you. From us." The room felt too small, the air too thick. It was too much, too fast, too devastating. But then he turned to her, his eyes searching hers. "And you?" His voice was barely a whisper. Did you know? The pain in his gaze shattered her. She reached for him, her fingers brushing his. "I swear, I didn't." For a moment, he didn't move. Then, slowly, he exhaled, nodding. A long silence stretched between them. Then he whispered, "Where is he now?" Her throat tightened. "With someone I trust." For the first time in years, she saw something shift in his expression. Something softer, something fragile. "Take me to him." The drive felt endless. The weight of everything that had just happened sat heavy in the silence between them, but neither of them spoke. There were no words for this. Not yet. When they finally arrived, she hesitated before stepping out of the car. He was already moving, his steps sure but tense. She followed him up the walkway, her heart hammering in her chest. The door opened before they could knock, and there he was, Leo, his dark eyes widened in surprise, his small hands gripping the edge of the doorframe. "Mom," she swallowed the lump in her throat. "Hey, sweetheart." Then Leo's gaze shifted past her, landing on him. His expression changed. Curious, cautious. She turned, watching as he took a slow, shaky breath. "Hi, Leo." Leo frowned slightly. "Who are you?" Her heart twisted. He crouched down, meeting Leo's gaze. His voice was soft but unsteady. I'm someone who should have been here a long time ago." Leo tilted his head. "Are you my mom's friend?" She felt tears threaten to spill. "Something like that." Leo studied him for a moment, then without warning, reached out and took his hand. His breath hitched. Leo looked up at him with big, innocent eyes. "Are you okay?" And just like that, the last wall crumbled. A broken breath left his lips, and he squeezed Leo's tiny fingers gently. "I am now." She wiped at her eyes, watching as the man she had once loved, the man she had never stopped loving, held onto the son he never knew he had. There were no more secrets, no more lies, just the truth, and for the first time in years, it was enough.